Once again, welcome to my classroom. What we're going to discuss today is we are going to look at thermodynamics, and in this class what we're trying to understand is we will have a look at what is thermodynamics in the context of biological systems, and then also try to understand how do the laws of thermodynamics apply in biological systems. So firstly, the first thing that we have to try and understand is what is thermodynamics. And if you look at thermodynamics, what we know from definition is that thermodynamics is the study of energy transformations in matter or an assemblage of matter, and energy transformations within the context of matter is what we term as the thermodynamic system. All right. So what we're really looking into is we're trying to understand how does energy transformation take place in an assemblage of matter or the thermodynamic system. So when you look at thermodynamics, it is concerned with the storage, the transformation, and the distribution or the dissipation of energy, and how this redistribution and transformation of energy takes place in relation to what we call the thermodynamic system and its surrounding environment. So if you look at thermodynamic systems, you can have three kinds of thermodynamic systems. You can have what we call as the open thermodynamic system. Now, in this kind of a thermodynamic system, you have energy from the surrounding can enter into the thermodynamic system, and energy from the thermodynamic system can also exit to the surrounding environment. And it's not only energy but also matter. So matter can enter into the thermodynamic system, and matter can also exit the thermodynamic system. And this is the kind of a thermodynamic system that we encounter in biological systems, where we take in energy and also give up energy. We take in energy in the form of food, and we give up energy in the form of heat or in the form of work. And matter also enters into our systems, and matter also exits the system. So that is the open thermodynamic system that we encounter in biological systems. Now, apart from this, we also have what we call as the closed thermodynamic system. Now here you only have an exchange of heat or energy between the system and the surrounding, but you do not have any exchange of matter. And this is called your closed thermodynamic system. And on the other hand, on the extreme end, you have a thermodynamic system where there is no exchange of matter and there's no exchange of heat. And this is called the isolated thermodynamic system. So when you talk of thermodynamic systems in terms of thermodynamics, then you can come across three very distinct thermodynamic systems: the open system, the closed system, and the isolated system. So when we try to define these systems, you have the definition as the open system is where you can have exchange of both energy and matter with the system and its surrounding environment. And as I said earlier, biological systems are open thermodynamic systems. When you have a closed system, there is no exchange of matter, but what you have is just the exchange of energy between the thermodynamic system and the surrounding environment. So energy flows into the thermodynamic system. When the energy flows into the thermodynamic system, you will have an increase in the energy of that thermodynamic system. And when energy exits the thermodynamic system, then the energy obviously of the system will decrease. And when you have a system where there is no exchange of energy and there is no exchange of matter, then such kind of a system is called as your isolated thermodynamic system. And so when we try to understand these thermodynamic systems, what we have is we try to understand the relationship that exists between the energy and the work done in the context of biological systems. And this allows us to understand the thermodynamics of the biological system. It also allows us to understand how changes in the energy, how the input of energy will affect a biological process or a biological system, or how the loss of energy will affect a biological process or a biological system. And when we carry out these studies, it allows us to understand how the biological processes are affected in terms of energy and in terms of the work done. And so when you look at thermodynamic system and biological processes, you can look at them in terms of plants. And what you have in plants is you have the input of energy and matter in the form of light, in the form of carbon dioxide, water, and all the ions and all the substrates. And these are the inputs into the thermodynamic system. And what we have as output is the matter, which is your oxygen and your chemicals and your water and your waste products. But also we have output in the form of energy, which is heat. So there is an exchange of energy and matter between the biological system, which in this case is your plant cell, and the surrounding environment. And the same also is true for animal cells. You have the same kind of a thermodynamic system where you have exchange of energy and you have an exchange of matter between the system and between the surrounding environment. And to explain all of these, we have the laws of thermodynamics. And when you look at the law of thermodynamics, we have 4 laws which have been put forward to try and understand and make sense of thermodynamics in our environment and between the systems. And we have the 0th law over here, and the 0th law normally deals with thermal equilibrium. So we have a condition where if one system is in thermal equilibrium with another system, with the second system, and the second system is in thermal equilibrium with the third, and the third is in equilibrium with the fourth, and so on, then the first thermodynamic system will be in thermal equilibrium with the last thermodynamic system in question. And it is this law that allows us to define the concept of temperature. Then we have the first law of thermodynamics, and this first law of thermodynamics is what really explains the law of conservation of energy, where energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but can only be transformed from one form to another. And we see a lot of the application of the first law of thermodynamics in biological systems. And what we will do is we will try to have a look and try to understand how the first law of thermodynamics is applicable to biological systems. We also have the second law of thermodynamics, and that second law is the law of entropy. And the law of entropy states that any thermodynamic system will always tend to progress towards the maximum state of entropy, or the maximum state of disorder. And this law, in fact, determines how biological processes take place in nature. And it governs the thermodynamics of biological processes along with their first law. And then we have the third law of thermodynamics, and this third law of thermodynamics is not directly relevant to biology, and therefore this is something that we will not focus on in this series, but we will focus only on the first law and the second law of thermodynamics and see how these two laws are applicable, in fact, in biological systems and in nature. So when we look at the first law of thermodynamics, that is the law of the conservation of energy. And this law states that energy that we know can neither be created nor can it be destroyed. But it can only be transformed, it can only be exchanged between a system and its surrounding in different forms. As a consequence of which, it means that the total energy that you have in a thermodynamic system plus the energy which is present in the surrounding, they will remain constant. So the total energy of a thermodynamic system plus its surrounding will remain constant because energy which is present within that thermodynamic system and the environment can neither be created nor can be destroyed, and therefore the sum total energy will always be constant. And as this energy gets transformed, the important thing to remember here is that as energy is transformed from one form to another, this energy conversion is not 100% efficient. And as a consequence, because it is inefficient, some of the energy is then lost as heat or is lost in increasing the disorder or the entropy of the surroundings. So that is the gist of the first law of thermodynamics. The law of conservation of energy. The total energy of the system plus the surrounding always remains constant. The energy can neither be created nor can it be destroyed. And the energy conversion is not 100% efficient. And in the process of energy transformation, some energy is lost, and that energy is utilized in increasing disorder or the entropy of the system or the surrounding. So with that background in mind, what we're going to look at is, we are going to look at an example that tries to explain that why energy is not 100% efficient. And if you look at this particular image that I've put over here, this is the food chain, the classic food chain that we know of in our studies. So we have the primary producer who takes in energy from the sun, and the primary producer produces the biomass, and energy from the sun is the input, and this input energy is utilized by the producer via the process of photosynthesis to produce organic matter. And some energy in the process is lost in the form of heat. Now, when this biomass is then consumed by the primary consumer, in this process the energy is transformed from this form into another form. But in this process also, the primary consumers will lose out some of the energy in the form of heat. And this is repeated from the primary to the secondary consumer, from the secondary consumer to the tertiary consumers, to the top consumers. So in each and every level, we have the loss of energy in the form of heat, albeit we also have the transformation of energy from one level to another level. And finally, when you have at each level, you have your producers. They may die off. When they die off and they undergo decomposition, the same happens with your primary consumers and secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. All of them undergo decomposition, and when they undergo decomposition, you again still have energy which is lost in the form of heat. So when you look at this diagram, it allows us to understand and appreciate the fact that energy transformations are not 100% efficient in biological systems. All right. But when we look at the first law itself, then we have the classic example of photosynthesis that allows us to understand the operation of the first law of thermodynamics in biological systems. And this is where you have the conversion of light energy into glucose by plants. So the input that we have is solar energy from the sun, and this energy in terms of photons is used up by the plant to drive the entire process of photosynthesis. And as a consequence of which, you get the carbohydrate, and then you have oxygen as a byproduct. So you have the input of energy, you have the input of matter in the form of carbon dioxide and water, and then you also have the output in terms of matter, in terms of your glucose and your oxygen, and you will also have energy which is lost in the form of heat from the plant. So you have an exchange of energy between the system, the thermodynamic system, which is the plant, and the surrounding environment. And if we are to describe this in terms of energy systems language, then what we have is we have the energy source, which is the sun, we have the thermodynamic system, which is the plant, and then we have the output, which is your carbohydrates and your oxygen. We have the energy storage in the forms of ATP, in the forms of NADPH, and then we also have some energy which is lost as heat. And the process of photosynthesis is one of the classic examples of the operation of the first law of thermodynamics in biological systems. And if you look at this in more detail, then what we have is here the entire conversion of light energy into glucose by plants via the process of photosynthesis, where we have the light dependent reactions of photosynthesis, where you have energy in the form of light is converted into ATP and NADPH. So these are forms of energy. ATP is the energy molecule in the cell. NADPH is energy in the form of reducing power. So energy is converted from light, from photons, through a series of reactions in the chloroplast, and via these reactions you have the transformation of light energy into ATP and NADPH, and you have an output in the form of oxygen. Now this ATP and NADPH, these energy forms then enter or participate in the light independent reactions of photosynthesis, and here again you have the input of energy and you have the input of your matter, and you have the Calvin cycle which takes place, and a series of reactions take place which finally gives us your carbohydrate, which is your sugars. And these sugars can then be utilized by the plant for various cellular processes and also as storage. So when you look at this process of photosynthesis, we find that the first law of thermodynamics is very, very prevalent in this reaction. And as I said earlier, it is one of the classic examples that you can have for the application of the first law of thermodynamics in biological systems. When we move on to the second law, and this is the law of entropy, this law states that the thermodynamic system and its surroundings will always tend to proceed to a maximum state of disorder or maximum entropy. And the reason is that living systems at the molecular level or at the level of the organism itself are very ordered structures. But because of the application of the second law of thermodynamics, these ordered systems will always have a tendency to move towards disorder, up to the point where that thermodynamic system will have no more available energy to do work. So it means that the entropy is a general indicator of the state of disorder, and it is associated with energy lost. So the more energy lost will lead to a more state of disorder. And the relation that the thermodynamic system has with its surroundings is that if the thermodynamic system is in a more ordered state, then the surrounding remains in a more disordered state, and vice versa. And the second law also implies that in the entire universe that we exist in, the entropy is increasing constantly because some of the heat is always released during energy conversion or during the application of the first law of thermodynamics. And to help us understand better the second law of thermodynamics and its application in biological systems, we will look at one example, and that is the example of enzyme catalysis. Now, when we study enzymes catalyze a reaction by forming what we call the enzyme substrate complex. And the formation of the enzyme substrate complex will always result in loss of entropy. And the reason is that the enzyme substrate complex is a highly ordered low entropy complex. So this low entropy complex is very different compared to what we have when we have the free enzyme and the substrate molecules. For example, if you have free enzyme in solution, if you have free enzyme in solution and you have substrates or reactants in the solution, these reactants along with the enzyme are in a highly disordered state because there is no order and their association with each other is very random. So the level of entropy here is very, very high. But because enzymes have your enzyme active sites which are very specific to the substrate, what the enzyme can do is it can help bind the substrate to the enzyme. So you have binding of the substrate to the enzyme via the enzyme active site. So as a consequence, what you have is that the enzyme now, the substrate is no longer present over here, but your substrate now in fact has bound over here. And similarly is the case with the second substrate. So the second substrate is no longer over here. We can just remove this one. And now your second substrate is now your second reactant is here. Now when these two reactants bind with the enzyme, so they form an enzyme substrate complex, which is now a more highly ordered complex compared to the free enzyme. And when this happens, what it does is it allows these two reactants to come closer together, and their chances of reacting now become higher as compared to when the enzyme was alone and the substrates were isolated from the enzyme. So therefore, enzyme catalysis functions on the basis of reducing the level of entropy that exists in a solution when you have enzyme and substrate together in the particular environment. And as a consequence, when that happens, the chances of reaction taking place between the two substrates are comparatively higher as compared when the substrates are free in solution. And when this takes place, then what the enzyme does is it helps to lower what we call as the activation energy of this entire reaction. And when the activation energy of the reaction is reduced, then the reaction can progress at a much faster rate as compared to the situation when you do not have an enzyme in the environment. So these two examples that I've just discussed, the example of photosynthesis and the example of enzyme catalysis, these are the two very classical examples that helps us to understand how the first laws and how the second laws of thermodynamics function in biological systems.